Okay, so here I am, and this is Naga King 07. You can just call me NK. And I'm here doing a compare and contrast with the 3 Yugioh series. I don't think I need to say the names because, well, you probably know them. So, yes, this is probably a rip off the Nostalgia Critic and others, but meh, what about it? So, well, we might as well start with the protagonists. So here we are with the original protagonists, or I suppose I would say protagonists, Yugi and Yami. Now, I think the idea behind Yugi prior to getting the Millennium Puzzle is he was sort of, well, the nerd, he was the geek. He was often picked on by bullies, and he was definitely not the popular guy. But then he gets the Millennium Puzzle, and the Pharaoh comes along, or as most people know him as just Yami. And Yami was kind of Yugi's opposite. He was always tough, he never said no to a challenge, and he always was ready and willing to go straight into a duel no matter what the opponents were like. In contrast to Yugi, who was typically timid, he often, actually as a matter of fact, by the end of the series he was greatly reliant on the Pharaoh, and typically it was probably supposed to create more conflict as kind of a teaching method. The Pharaoh taught Yugi, and at the same time Yugi taught the Pharaoh about, well, whatever the subject could be at the time. Yeah, so what really drove Yugi and Yami characters home was actually just the fact that they were so conflicting. Yugi was very, well, subdued. He was, by all means, he was not the ambitious type. He was not the kind of guy who would want to go into a challenge. While the Pharaoh, he always was ready to face someone, or at least it seemed that way. And he seemed to be the kind of character who was the tough side. And so ultimately this created a perfect character who was both soft and tough. And it actually helped a lot to the story because it created a lot of personal troubles inside both characters just because actually their characters are so conflicting. And yeah, so you had both the, well, ultimately you had a character who was both tough, as in like outgoing, and a character who was very subdued and never really wanted to do that much. Of course, however, I can't really honestly say that Yugi is in fact the perfect character because, of course, well, he isn't. And a lot of these problems come from the fact that they might have made Yugi's character a little too timid because he seemed almost helpless without the Pharaoh, and he was not very interesting and not very memorable without him. And with that being said, however, the Pharaoh kind of, the series was supposed to be about Yugi, but I think it might have been focused a little too much on Yami because he was actually a little, if it's possible, he was too interesting, he was too memorable, and he left an impression that actually seemed to ultimately work against the series in the end because it kind of defeated the purpose of kind of sending him back, even though it did count as a happy ending. But ultimately, you know, he was a little too interesting. He left too much of a real mark on the fans. With that done, now it's on to the second Yu-Gi-Oh series, Yu-Gi-Oh GX. Now, in the second Yu-Gi-Oh series, you have Jin Yuki, aka Yuki Judai. Now, oh, I haven't bothered, I'm just going to be flat up honest. Jaden is just plain annoying. That's simple. He was the most naive, probably the most airheaded character in the entire franchise, and he never took anything seriously, be it classes or like people's opinions on him. He pretty much thought everybody liked him. He was always the kind of guy who would always take things with a smile, and while it is something good, he does it too much, and his impression is more of that of a mega fan. He was kind of the more annoying sort of guy. And one of his redeeming qualities, however, is he was one of those respectful guys. He never taunted his opponents, he never mocked them, and he was always ready to respect them. With that said, however, Jane was actually by the end, at the time of the season 4, either the creators decided to change him, and basically, it was like they were trying to make him the more serious guy, and ultimately, it seems they tried way too hard. Jane quickly became probably the most serious character in the entire franchise. he really smiled out on a court. I can actually think of only like 2 times in the entire series. Probably there was a couple more in which he smiled out his own accord. And it seems like they were trying to make Jane the more serious guy, and while it worked, they didn't seem to make. They seemed to try too hard, and they created kind of like the kind of guy who was too serious. He was too deadpan, and ultimately that actually worked against him and made him a little worse than his first parts. And here we are with the third and most recent Yugioh series, Yugioh 5Ds. Yeah, so in this series we have Yusei Fudo as the main protagonist. Now, Yusei was sort of the kind of character who was Jane's exact opposite in the first couple of seasons of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, in which he was very calm, he was very level-headed, and I can only think of a couple of times in which he lost his cool. And he never really took anything lightly, to my knowledge, and I've actually been keeping very up-to-date on the series so far. And ultimately, Yusei was the sort of character who, while he did typically have a serious demeanor when it came to duels, he was the kind of guy who also had the soft interior. He was always ready to protect his friends, even if it meant putting his own life on the line. I'll be a little more specific on that a little later. And an interesting thing about Yusei is he's the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Protagonist in which has demonstrated skills outside of dueling. He's demonstrated very good skills in mechanics and also in kickboxing. With all that said, however, Yusei was still not the perfect character, and he did have his flaws. One of which was sort of, while he was the no-nonsense sort of character, he did have kind of the character who by now was a bit overdone. There was always a character who had like friendship is the most important thing in the world. And while that was very important in the series, by this point it was a little overused, and I think Yusei kind of actually stressed it a little too much in his character, in which there was almost always a scene in which he would refer to bonds with his friends, in which bonds in this case, due to the storyline, was probably one of the most critical aspects though, but Yusei kind of stressed the friendship thing a little too much, and ultimately it became, by this point, well, cliched in a sense.